The first thing I want to do is, before we discuss the various aspects of the rise of socialism, I just would like to get a perspective from each of you in slightly different form, and I'll start with you, Karl. When we talk about American socialism, how would you define that phenomenon?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me with this august panel here, particularly the two actual journalists here. And, look, the amazing thing about American socialism is it doesn't fit a precise and consistent definition. If you look at what passes for American socialism, like in the Gilded Age, the first rise of socialism in the form of the American populace, and then the 1930s, and then sort of its reemergence in an abbreviated way in the late 60s and early 70s, and then today, it's more populist than it is socialist until the most recent iteration. You know, if you look at if you look back at the Gilded Age, they wanted an income tax. They wanted public ownership of the railroads. Or if not that, they wanted the government to set rates for the railroads. But today we have full-blown socialism as we understand it around the world. Government ownership of the means of production, confiscation of wealth, and so forth. So, you know, there's been no consistent definition. The one constant in it is that it's populist in nature and emerges at a moment of populist agitation. The agrarian revolt of the 1870s and 1880s, the populism of the 1930s in reaction to the Great Depression and 1 out of every 4 Americans being out of work. And today, I think, in largely, not totally, but substantially in response to the aftermath of the financial crisis, where on the left, the populism was the banks got bailed out and you did it with money that you took from me, and the relationship between the little man and the little woman and their government has become perverted because the rich are getting richer and I'm not. And so therefore it needs to be rebalanced by taking from them that's got and giving it to them that don't.
Right.
But it also had a right-wing version of it, which was the banks got bailed out, you did it with my money, I paid my bills, I paid my mortgage, and yet you took money from me to bail out people who were irresponsible, and then you kept taking money to give to people who had a loophole in the law or a lobbyist in Washington like Solyndra, and the relationship between the little man and the little woman has become distorted and needs to be rebalanced by God, respecting me for once.
Right.
And stop taking money out of my pocket and giving to the people who don't deserve it.
Byron, you've been reporting on, for decades, on ideas. You've been reporting on the Democrats as well as on Republicans. What's the difference between the new socialist movement and the standard progressive agenda that we've come to know and love?
Less and less and less, I think. I mean, as Karl said, this is something we've always had with us. There were a couple of socialist members of Congress in the early 20th century. There are a few now. The socialist candidate for president got 6% of the popular vote in 1912. That's not nothing. So they've always been around. I do think, I mean, the reason we're having this conversation is because of Bernie Sanders and the particular power that he had over young voters in 2016, and again to a slightly lesser extent in 2020. And you basically have this man who's really kind of a hardcore commie and goes to the Soviet Union.
To honeymoon.
To honeymoon.
To be on the Volga looking at a statue of Lenin, it's a romantic experience.
He'll never forget it. And so, and then sort of remaking himself, going to the House and then the Senate as this quirky guy, and he catches on. And so I do think the Democratic platform, if you look at what Democrats wanted in the 80s in terms of health care, what they tried with Hillary Clinton in the 1990s, then what they got with Obamacare, I think there's this, with the socialists, there is this ratcheting up effect, and I think Medicare for All is as close to a socialist sort of program as you could get. It's a complete nationalization of the health insurance industry, which would probably be a nationalization of the whole thing at some point. And as far as, now Kristen knows about this, as far as young voters, when I go to Bernie things, it feels a little bit like a fashion statement amongst some young voters, not saying they don't deeply believe this, but the current vogue, I think, has something to do with that.
Right. I'm going to come to Kristen. I would have thought that, you know, any newlywed bride would not forgive her husband for taking her on a honeymoon to. I went to Russia before the fall of the Berlin Wall. The food alone would enough to break up a marriage. I would say.
Be careful, because we have a couple here where his great idea for celebrating their 20th anniversary was bringing her to the Washington Examiner conference. So we've got some
the man's
people
a genius
on the right who've got sort of weird. I'm not saying who my fellow Texans are that did this, but anyway.
Kristen, you know, as a pollster, you're obviously finding out what Americans actually believe. So, what do young Americans believe when they say that they support socialism? What do they think this phenomenon is, and how right are they and how wrong are they?
So it's not just a phenomenon focused on young people, but it's particularly acute with young people, that there has been this shift in what people mean when they say socialism. And this goes back over 50, 60 years. Gallup asked people in the 1940s, what do you think the word socialism means? And a plurality back in the 1940s said it's something like communism, it's government owning, you know, major portions of the economy, you know, they've seized the means of production, that kind of answer. Only a very small portion said it means we all work together, it means benefits, it means fairness. Nowadays, the bulk of people say it means benefits, it means fairness, it means we all work together. It doesn't mean the government seizes the means of production. And so when I find, especially talking to young voters who don't have that memory of the Berlin Wall falling, is when you say, look how terrible socialism is. Look what happened in the Soviet Union. Look what happens in Venezuela. Look at these examples of the devastation that socialism has wrought. And they go, well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Denmark. Denmark seems so happy. And that's what I think socialism is. And so in their minds, there's what I think doesn't quite match up about this is to Karl's point and to Byron's point about how, you know, this is, in the American context nowadays, there's this populist thread that runs through it of, I believe that the rich have too much and they should have less of it so that it's paying for benefits for all of us. In some of these European countries, the compact is a little bit different. It's more of a we're all in this together, so I'm a citizen in Denmark, I pay 50% income taxes. Here, the reason why you see someone like Elizabeth Warren dance around this question of, are you going to raise taxes on the middle class when she's asked about her health care plan, is that by admitting that, yes, you'll have to raise taxes on the middle class, it's betraying this, oh, no, the rich are just going to pay for everything, sort of myth that gets built up in the way that Americans, especially young Americans, think of socialism. That to the extent they think of it at all as the government and the economy, the government playing a bigger role in the economy, they think it's the wealthy that are going to be footing the bill, not them. And their perception of what is fair changes radically when you point out to them it doesn't always work out that way. But I've also had in focus groups, young people, young voters, when I say, what do you think socialism is, they will say, is it using social media? I mean, there are some young people who just, they don't know. And so it is a bit of a fashion statement. If you think that socialism means public schools, roads, and using Instagram, you can see why someone might be a little more favorable to the term.
We ran a story in the New Magazine about a month ago under the headline, American Socialism is the Worst. And the writer posited the idea that whereas traditional European socialism or old-fashioned socialism had some defining, as it were, limitations, it was about controlling the means of production and that sort of thing. The modern American socialism is really just a sort of pressure towards a very vaguely understood equality, egalitarianism, and that can metastasize and expand to consume anything that it wants to, and it can go into sexual politics and the way that we, you know, our whole attitude towards marriage, that's all talked about as marriage equality. And so Karl, is American socialism more dangerous than the traditional socialism because it is so vaguely defined and can expand and consume everything?
Yeah, well, let's be clear. It's clearly defined in the minds of the ideologues who lead it. It's not clearly defined in sort of many of the followers. Who I agree with you that a large measure of this is fairness. Another big part, I've seen focus groups on this among sort of 20s and 30 years old. Socialism is equated in a large measure with acceptance of diversity. We are a diverse society, whether it's your cultural background, your race, your gender, your attitudes about sex. We're accepting of diversity. But let's not kid ourselves. You look at these people who are in charge of, who sort of put them in charge of this. Medicare for all, for example. It ain't Medicare. It ain't Medicare at all. Medicare is a program that we pay into all of our lives through a tax, and we are in essence buying an insurance policy for the years that we're going to be seniors. That's the underlying principle of Medicare. This ain't it. Everybody's, quote, contributions to Medicare get wiped out overnight, and everybody gets tossed into the same program that's available to everybody. And but they're marketers. And so what they decided to do was, let's take something that is popular and claim that we're going to give you that, when in reality you aren't. Under Medicare, you get to choose your doctor. You get to choose your, you get to augment it with Medicare Advantage. You get to, have a personal relationship. Here we're going to be in charge of the government. It's going to determine, who gets to see whom when, and who gets to have a procedure when. So the followers are not as well ideologically attuned as their leaders are. They're just simply following along in this crusade.
But the state of the Socialist Party in America is just remarkably uncreative at this moment. I went to the website of my investigative reporting, the Democratic Socialists of America, and they list their main activist priorities as voted on by their delegates at their convention, and there are just three. It is Medicare for all, strong unions, and electoral power, which means electing more socialists. And you're right about Medicare for all. It's a popular word. It tests well. If you say Medicaid for all, it really tests badly. Yeah. So Medicare for all.
Single-payer health doesn't test well. Government-run health care doesn't test well. So we got the victory of the socialist marketeers.
Correct.
So,
that's a good term, victory of the socialist marketeers.
I'm going to use it in my column.
Thank
Don't
you.
use
Okay.
it. I steal ideas from you, but it's not fair to return it. Can I say one other thing, though, about this?
Please.
Yeah, look, why else has this arrived? I think there are a couple other reasons that we need to examine. They're not as important as the financial crisis that I think has created this atmosphere. The long march of the 60s radicals through academia, and now the movement of their graduate students into positions of power in higher education. You go on a college campus, and maybe outside of the economics department and the engineering department, the left controls. Right. And so the mindset is, this is all acceptable. The exhaustion of traditional liberalism. The sort of the blue collar, FDR, Great Society, FDR liberalism is now exhausted, and so they're looking around for what comes next. Right. And then the disappointment in the Obama administration. It gets to me, it's amazing to me how many Democrats say, why is not Obama dominating this election on the Democratic side? We got one guy who says, I was part of the Obama administration, and we got everybody else relatively silent about those years. It's because the left of the Democratic Party had high expectations that he was going to take the country far to the left, and he failed to do so. And so now they're looking around for somebody who will grab that banner and run with it. But and yet, within the Democratic Party, conservatives and moderates and traditional liberals are a big majority. The self-described very liberal or progressives are a minority, but that's where the energy is inside the Democratic Party today.
Yeah. So those are all sorts of reasons why it would happen now, but are there additional ones, such as it's 30 years since Soviet socialism was defeated, and there are tens or possibly more than tens of millions of people who are grown up now, and for them that's ancient history. Is it about the time that's gone by since then, a terrible education system? Is it about fabulous affluence that we have in this country and that people think that they can take it for granted? Anyone?
I think it's a little bit of all of those. I think, especially for younger Americans, there is not a sense of what happened in the Cold War. Why did the Soviet system not work? I think there is sort of a lack of knowledge around why socialism has failed historically. But I do also think that if you are young in America today and you came of age in an era in the shadow of 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial crisis, you're not wrong to look around and go, we entered the job market at a particularly tough time. Our lifetime earnings are going to be set back. I don't mind that my boss makes more money than me. I don't mind that the CEO of my company makes more money than me. But when it's 100x, 200x, when it's that much more, or when I see a headline about a CEO who's driven a company into the ground and walks away with $1.7 billion, WeWork, you're not wrong as a young American to go, wait a minute. I went to college, I got that degree just like everybody told me to. I'm paying off this loan debt. I'm having trouble moving up in my career and getting the job that I always thought I was promised. And yet capitalism has made it so that this joker can walk away with $1.7 billion for driving a company into the ground. Something seems wrong. And that sense of unfairness, I think, is what allows so many young people, they don't want the government to seize the means of production, but they'd like a system where if you work hard and play by the rules, you can get ahead. And they're not wrong for thinking that we don't really have that in practice in the United States today.
And the parties have remarkably different views of the word socialism. Do you like the Pew polling? Is that?
I do like
Okay,
Pew's
okay.
polling.
So Pew did a big poll over the summer and asked a very simple question, which is, what's your impression? What impression do you have of socialism? And Republicans were 84% negative. 63 of those were very negative. So it's a really, really negative opinion. There are 15% who have a positive impression of socialism. Don't know if we have any here, but Democrats, only 33% had a negative impression of socialism. And by the way, only 7% had a very negative. So the opinion on socialism really separates itself very nicely by parties, and Democrats like it mostly.
But curiously, and this is why I think you see Elizabeth Warren trying very carefully to avoid calling herself a socialist, in the way that Bernie Sanders will give speeches defending the term democratic socialism and trying to claim it for himself, Elizabeth Warren tries to very carefully say, well, no, I'm a capitalist. I just want capitalism that works for everyone. And I think she's very savvy in doing so, because that same Pew poll showed that while a lot of Democrats feel neutral to warm toward socialism, they also mostly feel neutral to warm toward capitalism. And there are a lot of people, especially young people, who view it as it's not binary, it's a spectrum. They don't view it as capitalism or socialism, but it's, well, are there places where maybe socialism can inform our economic policies to make things a little more fair?
That is the Sweden effect, which Bernie is always talking about Sweden or Denmark. We should be able, if they can do these things with these little tiny countries, we can do these things with 325 million people.
Yeah, let's have Sweden, which has a form of capitalism that is almost American in nature. Right. They have unlimited charter schools. They have high taxes, but they're less than they were in the past, and they believe they ought to be lowered further. I mean, in what is a traditionally social democratic country, the amount of capitalism that is available is really remarkable.
I would jump in on, you mentioned democratic socialism, and Bernie Sanders often refers to it. I would warn anybody that as soon as somebody tries to modify a noun with the word democratic, your suspicions should be raised. You remember that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is North Korea. The German Democratic Republic was East Germany. And, it's one of those sort of odd things where you have to label something which is somewhat the opposite. And it's actually on that subject I wanted to get to. Socialists in America now seem to me to regard the Constitution as an impediment. They want to, the extreme left is challenging freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. They're challenging the Second Amendment, which is sort of self-defense and guns. Is there something fundamentally incompatible, Karl, between the socialism that is now being put out there on the left and the founding document of this country?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. In fact, look, this goes back. In the progressive era, we have sort of socialist light, people who, the progressive movement ranged from sort of moderately traditional and conservative to very sort of left. And the more left you got, the more angry the progressives got with constitutional restraint. And so there's always been in sort of the socialist movement inside the United States. I mean, the income tax was unconstitutional until the passage of an amendment to allow it. But that didn't deter the populists in the 1880s and 1890s having it as their number one or number two issue. So yeah, I think there is a very large strain inside the socialist movement inside the Democratic Party. At its most benign form, it's an impatience with constitutional restraint, but at its true form, it is outright opposition to the constitutional restraint. We're noodling around something, though. This is a serious movement, and the conservative movement both in its ideological form and in its expression through political parties, has got to confront this as a serious movement and make a concerted attack upon it so that people understand, particularly voters who are sort of either young or mildly affected by it but not yet bought into the movement, realize how bad it is. And there's got to be, we got to treat these things seriously. You know, you read that first draft of the Green New Deal, and I mean, first of all, it's very funny. It's jaw-droppingly stupid. But on the other hand, we ought to treat it seriously. So we can say, this is what these people really want to do. They really don't want you to be able to have the freedom to go get on an airplane. They really don't want to have us to be able to have access to inexpensive food. They want everybody to have, 60 acres and a mule. These people really don't want you to be able to travel long distances to visit people across the country or enjoy our great country. They want you to have to get on, quote, high-speed trains to get everywhere. They want to retrofit. They want to tell you what your house ought to look like and how it ought to be retrofitted to be energy efficient. And one of my favorite phrases, they want federal standards for comfort in your house. Well, please, my man cave, I get to decide what's comfortable. Screw you, government bureaucrat. You don't get to say that lumpy chair and that desk that is all banged up are not, quote, comfortable. I get to decide. So we got to treat this seriously and begin to go after them, no matter how outrageous their ideas are and how unlikely we think that they are to be adopted. Let's make everybody pay a penalty inside the liberal movement and inside the Democratic Party for allowing them to be associated with these people.
I just want to jump in first and again and remind people to, if you have questions, do write them down and hold them up in the air, and then they'll come through to the iPad here so that I can ask the panelists the things that you want to hear. Just to come back to that, I think that what you were just saying about, intruding into the man cave, it's just, modern American socialism will go everywhere, and it was more and more limiting on freedom. I wanted to ask you, we need to take this seriously. Does the conservative movement, such as it is, have the politicians now who can articulate it? And I asked this question from a sort of something of a sort of nostalgic point of view, is that it seems to me that the last person who could be very popular and conservative was Ronald Reagan. There have been people who've had considerable ability since then, perhaps not to that extent. Do we have the politicians who can articulate this?
Karl?
Yes and no. No, we don't have them visible today. Yes, they're there underneath the surface. I'm particularly, we used to sort of derive our strength from the appeal of governors, but I'm looking at the second level inside the United States Senate. I'm looking at people like Dan Sullivan and Tom Tillis and Tom Cotton. I'm looking at people who are they went to Washington to do something. They're frustrated with their inability to do something, but they're willing to make the case. And as time naturally passes and they rise in power and authority, that group is going to get things done.
I do think, yes, it's socialism represents a threat, but I think actually for most of us today, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party represents really a greater threat, and because they basically want to attack the first two amendments of our Constitution. I mean, you see the limits in speech that they would impose and do impose in many places, and you've seen in this recent Democratic campaign the limits that they would place on the Second Amendment. And I mean, you have one candidate talking openly about gun confiscation, and they would enforce all this by a number of them would like to increase the number of judges on the Supreme Court, at least long enough to get what they want done, and then they can reduce the number again. So I mean, they're actually very serious about this, and this is not the Democratic Socialists of America. These are a lot of people in the Democratic mainstream.
Yeah, I'd have a tactical disagreement. Treat them all over as lunatics, and make them disavow. Look, when Robert Francis O'Rourke says, "I'm going to take away your gun, and if you belong to a church that believes in traditional marriage, I'm going to take away your tax advantage and demolish the Catholic Church. Damn those Catholics for all their good charitable work. They should be doing it by endorsing same-sex marriage. I mean, make them pay for that, and let them sort out who is the left-wing progressive and who's the left-wing democratic socialist. If they got bad ideas, make them all responsible for it until and unless they disassociate themselves from it. I want them to be in a place where in Texas, whoever the Democratic nominee is for the U.S. Senate, I want them to say, I don't agree with Elizabeth Warren on fracking because I think it is a radical approach and it would decimate our economy. I want them to have to say that because there are, even in Texas, lunatics who say Elizabeth Warren is right. And Bernie, Robert Francis O'Rourke, I want people to say, by God, I don't agree with him that we ought to confiscate people's weapons.
You know who comes out of Texas who I think is a great advocate for a lot of this is Dan Crenshaw. He's somebody who, he's young, he's willing to engage in culture. You may recall late last year the sort of kerfluffle around Saturday Night Live and Saturday Night Live making fun of him because he lost his eye in combat. And he responded, I thought, in the most effective way, which was he then accepted SNL's offer to come onto their program and sort of make fun of them right back on TV instead of sort of sulking and saying, I'm a victim. He engaged with the culture. And I think in order to persuade especially some of the younger voices in America who don't necessarily know how they think about socialism, but they feel vaguely warm toward it, having people who are not just talking in political circles, but will engage with culture is important. And Crenshaw is somebody who, I had him on my radio show a few months ago. The questions I was asking him were not about socialism versus capitalism necessarily, but he would come back to that divide, about the encroaching threat of socialism in the threat it poses to our American way of life. He would come back to that frequently. So he's very, very effective at making that argument, and I think he's someone to watch.
Yeah, I think that he's a very affable and engaging politician, and this comes back to something which the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, a behavioral economist, said, which is that people believe arguments not simply because there are facts and statistics that support your case, they believe people who they like. And I think that was the great strength of Reagan. I think it's the strength of someone like Daniel Kahneman. I want to get to that aspect. We were talking about the left and a distinction without a difference between socialists and modern progressives. The fact that they will say America was never great. They don't like the founding document. This gets to it's unfashionable now to talk about an un-American state of mind. But is socialism actually an un-American state of mind, a set of beliefs? Is it actually incompatible with what this country is? Karl?
Well, look, it is. You put your finger on an interesting thing. The early American socialists, the populists, if you will, of the Gilded Age, wrapped themselves in the flag. I mean, the poem on the Statue of Liberty was written by a socialist American, and yet today, you're right. I love the great speech that Gene Kirkpatrick gave about San Francisco Democrats, about people who really who were expressing an animus towards the greatness of our country, and I think that has been found for a variety of reasons on the hard left and among the progressive circles, and it's actually a weakness because ordinary Americans have an enduring pride and patriotism, pride in our country, and a patriotism that is, sort of comes from the heart. So we ought to dwell on that and find a way to deal with it. I was at a conference recently. Small business people, insurance agents, healthcare professionals and providers. So it was sort of an eclectic crowd, and it was sort of in a small town, not the normal American big conference city, and so they had Q&A, and the guy gets up, and so we had lots of weird questions. So the guy gets up at this thing devoted mostly to healthcare for small business people and says, I'm sick and tired of people, talking about what are we going to do about all these climate nuts. And I said, we need to worry about it and blah, 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 blah. And finally, though, I got sort of in a rant. I said, one thing that bothers me is we're the only major industrialized country in the world that for the last 20 years has reduced the absolute level of greenhouse gas emissions while growing our economy. And yet we're the problem. And that's what happened. That's what happened, spontaneous applause. People were like, stand up for our country. Yeah, we've had warts, we've had problems. But at the end of the day, no country is better suited to meet the challenges of the 21st century than ours. And our country has done so many great and glorious things on behalf of its citizens and the world and asked for nothing in return.
There was an animus toward America for a long time until Donald Trump pledged to make America great again, at which point they all immediately said, America is already great.
Oddly enough, it's either already great and Donald Trump can't make it great, or it never was great, and he can't therefore make it great again.
Yeah, what amazed me were the people who have started to pop up with the last one. I mean, you see it in our history, you see it in our popular culture, you see it among public intellectuals. It's almost like Trump represents a requirement to them that they tell everybody how America was never great, and why we are sin-filled. And I mean, think about it. The whole idea of reparations has popped up now. And, you know, we last saw that, you know, during the civil rights movement, but we didn't hear it from the mainstream members of the civil rights movement. We didn't hear it from Martin Luther King. We heard it from the black nationalists. And now we're seeing it again. And why? Because it allows them to affirm that we really are a stained country, that we were born out of a corrupt bargain between slaveholders and New Englanders, and you know, we have sins that we have to pay for. And again, I think we've got two different Americas here. We got one America that reacts to America as it has been and is, and another a group of Americans who are seeking, you know, to run down the country in order to gain support for their agenda.
Right, and the New York Times, with its 1619 project, it wants to redefine the founding of America to the date when the first slaves were brought to the United States, and they are putting together an educational program on the basis of this that they want to get into all the schools. There's a question from the audience which I think goes to that, and it's how can each of us, how can conservatives participate and take action to prevent further progress of the socialist movement? And Kristen, how can people get involved? They're not the politicians, but they really want to make a difference.
So I always come back to finding ways to support the young people who are taking the brave stands in their classrooms, on their campuses, in their friend groups, to stand up for American values, to stand up and say, socialism's actually not great. Socialism's not what you think it is, and it's not wonderful. Right now, I mean, I recall when I was in college, being able to proudly say that I was going to support President Bush's re-election, and that was not something that made me strange in my friend group at all, particularly. And nowadays, if you are a young American and you even so much as slightly feel conservative, and I think we put a lot of focus on things like the professors, et cetera, but it is really more about peer pressure, I find in my research, that people are afraid if they come out and say that, you know, maybe they don't love everything Trump does, but maybe they think something he did was pretty interesting, that they'll immediately be condemned by all of their friends. And so finding ways to help support these young people so that they can feel comfortable being a little bit more public in their views, so that their friends who might not have strongly formed views can go, oh, I wouldn't be alone if I was conservative. I think that's really important, and it's very micro level if you have young people in your lives, kids, grandkids, supporting them if they have conservative views, but also finding good organizations that do really fascinating work, empowering young people so that the next generation won't be lost.
Can I second that emotion, as they say, and say with one caveat, it's great to support them, but do it at the local level first. Yeah. Everybody can send the check to the national organization. I do a bunch of college campuses. I've done 3 college campuses in the last 2 months. And you do want to have conservatives on campus. But sometimes those campus students, I mean, you know, $500 to the campus conservative club at Tufts goes a long way. $500 to some national organization may go somewhat of a way, but start locally. There's going to be a campus near you that has a conservative club or a college Republican club, and a little bit of money goes a long way. And, you know, Mario Andretti, remember him? Okay. Do you know he underwrites a lecture program at the University of California, Santa Barbara? I went out there and spoke. He's done it for years. Brings a conservative to this most liberal of campuses. He holds a reception beforehand. I was so thrilled to be able to meet him because having, you know, grown up in the late 60s and 70s, I still remember, you know, he was then advertising on television for his additive, but here was the guy who'd won the Indy 500 so many times. So I go out there and I'm expecting to meet Mario Andretti, and in comes this guy on a little scooter, morbidly obese on this little scooter, and it's Mario Andretti. But he underwrites the campus conservative lecture series. And at the end of it, he says to me, he says he was going to take all the members at the reception over to get in their special seats. And he says to me, "Good luck to you. Hope you're safe." I said, "What are you telling me, man?" He said, "It's a little bit of a rambunctious campus." But you know what? There's an example of a guy who's making a difference. I had lunch that day with all of the campus Republican leaders, and this was the event around which they sort of rallied. And so start local. There's going to be some local organization, some campus organization, some state college organization that's going to be worthy of your support, and a little bit of support there will go a long, long way.
I think you were right to mention the 1619 Project. Is everybody aware of what the New York Times is doing in the 1619 Project? Okay. There was a meeting, an all-hands meeting, employees meeting at the New York Times a while back, and it was recorded secretly, and the transcript actually leaked. You can go read it. And the executive editor of the New York Times said, "We built our newsroom around one story," the one story being the Trump-Russia matter, and that didn't work out. So we got to do something else. And what they decided to do was to now focus on Donald Trump's alleged racism and what they called the 1619 Project, which sought to, quote, reframe the American founding. And you may think of the founding as the Declaration of Independence or the Federalist Papers and the Constitution. But they redefined it as the arrival of the first black Africans who were sold as slaves in 1619 in Virginia. And the point of the 1619 Project is to connect every area of American life, every business activity, every cultural activity, every educational activity to slavery. And I mean, it would be fine if this was, you know, a special edition of the Times Magazine. But they've partnered with a group called the Pulitzer Center, which is not the group that hands out the prizes, but is a journalism organization, which has created curricula based on the 1619 Project. And they are now traveling around the country, redefining the founding. So that is what's going on, and it's a big deal for them, and they're a very powerful company with a big megaphone. So it's that kind of stuff you need to know about.
Yeah, and look, it's derivative, because you know why they started it? In addition to the sort of to mollify the young 20-year-olds inside the company who were outraged at a neutral headline about Donald Trump, literally a neutral headline. They wanted it to be slanted. And you got to read the transcript. The transcript is jaw-dropping. It is the obituary of the journalism that was once practiced at the New York Times. But you know why they call it this? You know why they picked out 1619 as well? Because they were upset with the fact that 1619 was also and was honored this year with a huge group of celebrations in Virginia as the first meeting of the first representatively elected legislature in the North American continent, the Virginia House of Delegates. They've then called the Virginia House of Burgesses. And so it was sort of like, okay, Virginia is commemorating the birth of an important element of our democracy. We must slander it and slam it by saying that that is less important than the arrival of the 40 earliest slaves in America.
Yeah. This, what the New York Times is doing obviously goes directly to the question about what can people do. I was talking with somebody last night at the drinks party, and we were discussing the fact that conservatives don't think that life is about more than politics. Life is about faith and various other things which have nothing to do with politics. On the left, people believe much more commonly that life is what, politics is what life is for. Life is about politics. So they work at every level all the time and constantly. And one of the things that conservatives have to do is to be involved at the local level and at every level. Not just, as has been said, just write the check, but actually get involved and be involved in schools, whether it's children's schools or grandchildren's schools, to try and make sure that they're not being fed propaganda as a constant diet. And, they're emerging from conservative and religious families, going to college and ending up as socialists. Kristen, I wanted to come back to you. You mentioned about conservatives feeling that they're alone and feeling that they can't admit what they are. That goes to some extent to the character of the president, about which a lot of people are embarrassed. Is he the right person? This is a question from the audience. Is he the right person to be leading this fight?
I worry, I don't want to just have this fight be fought by any one particular individual, because then it becomes wrapped up in their personality, it becomes wrapped up in their quirks, their style, their way of presenting things. And the president is not everybody's cup of tea. I think a lot of people, if you already like President Trump, you probably don't like socialism a whole lot. There's, as Byron mentioned, there's a really strong correlation between these sorts of things, your partisan political views and your views on something like socialism. So I'm looking for folks who are able to talk to, one, again, a younger audience, because that's where you tend to find the biggest pockets of people who are socialism curious. And two, folks that are more politically centrist, folks who may have a sort of a plague on all your houses approach. So that's why, to Karl's point, I'm less of the mind that a lot of the big current names out there, including the president, are the right messengers, and I think we need to be looking for that next generation of folks who can speak to those who are less partisan and who are younger.
Well, he may not be the right messenger, but he will be the messenger next year. That's just going to be a fact. Trump thinks that socialism is going to be a very effective charge to use against whoever is nominated by the Democrats, and certainly he has people like the Squad and Bernie, whatever happens to Bernie, to talk about. So that is going to be one of his messages. And it's not like Reagan, who actually, you know, the Cold War was the backdrop of his conversion to conservatism, and he actually studied it. He read a lot. After he died, we saw a lot of his notes for radio scripts and things that were written in his own hand. It was very clear he had thought pretty deeply about this. Trump, not so much, but he's going to be the messenger.
Which is why his campaign's got to be disciplined. He may not be the most disciplined person, but his campaign has to be disciplined, because this can't be merely a label. This has got to be an explanation.
Right.
And so his campaign has got to be disciplined in their messaging, in my opinion, to be able to get this message across. You throw the word socialist at Elizabeth Warren, and she's going to say, well, I want to save capitalism from its excesses. So got to be able to make a disciplined, concerted effort that says, here are the bad things about this. You know, she wants to ban fracking. Here's what's going to happen. She wants to end drilling for oil and gas on federal lands on her first day in office. This is what's going to happen. She wants to do this to America's companies. She wants to do this to health care. I mean, we've got to be in a position where we treat the American people with respect enough to explain what the hell we're concerned about.
I want to ask a question connected to that, which is or connected to the election as well. Sometimes people, conservative politicians, are rather glad to see their opposition being extreme left-wingers. They think, oh, this is going to make things easier for us, and perhaps in the short term it does. I get the sense that eventually voters get bored with whatever dispensation is in place, and obviously, being English, I also look at what's going on in England, and I think, you know, be careful that you are glad that Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of the Labour Party, because eventually he could be Prime Minister. Likewise here. Should we be careful what we wish for and not want radicals on the left, because eventually they're going to get in power?
Yeah, absolutely, but guess what? We don't have any control over that. They are who they are, and they're going to emerge, and you know, think about it. They've emerged inside the Democratic Party, much to the consternation of the Democratic Party. Right. I mean, do you think Hillary Clinton liked the fact that she was running against a Democratic socialist who raised $230 million without holding a single fundraising event? She's having to go to the next party at the next Hollywood residence or New York apartment or Chicago condo, and Bernie's sending out a tweet or an email, and left-wing lunatics with credit cards are showering them with contributions, proving there is a fundamental flaw in our credit system that so many communists can get credit cards. But you know, no. Yeah, we should. I worry about a system in which one party or the other has gone off the edge, because two things will happen. The party that is the party that wins, because the other party's gone off the edge, will get sloppy, And the party ultimately that's gone off the edge will either find its way back, or the big party will become the little party because they got too sloppy. And in which case you have a Jeremy Corbyn or a whomever in America, a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren, jumps up.
Well, but isn't that just the normal course of events? I mean, Democrats lose in 1980, they lose in 1984. Some of them start saying, are we doing the wrong thing? And most of them say, no, it's just a messaging problem. They lose in 1988, and some of them say, you know, we really are soft on crime, and we're soft on the Russians. I mean, we need to change. And the others are saying, no, it's a messaging problem. And finally, Bill Clinton emerges out of all this and does a better job of being a Democratic candidate. And sometimes parties have to just hit the bottom before they get better.
Yeah, but let's be careful, because in 1992, William Jefferson Clinton gets the same percentage of the vote that
43.
That Michael Dukakis got in 1988. So without the presence of Ross Perot on the ballot, they might have gone one more cycle, and God knows what would have happened then. We can't take it for granted that the American system is going to balance the equilibrium is going to balance itself each and every time. That's, I think, one of the thoughts in the British system was, we'll never get mad Jeremy Corbyn because he is, anti-Semitic and way out there and, fellow traveler, and guess what happens? He wins control of the party, and because of the nature of their electoral system. Thank God for the electoral college in the United States, which keeps lunacy like that from happening in the United States. But it's not to say it couldn't happen here, particularly if the Democratic Party remains in the thrall of its left.
There's a question from the audience which touches on this, and it's whether or not the panelists believe that there should be a constitutional amendment to prevent the packing of the Supreme Court and the expansion of it. If the Supreme Court is the backstop that prevents socialism from taking over, would that be a good idea? Byron.
Boy, I was just...
hoping not to get that question.
Well, it wasn't. I mean, it's not in the Constitution that there are 9. It can be changed. It has been changed. And
I think that's why
what has stopped it in the past, what stopped it in the 1930s was political uproar. Generally, I'm not in favor of constitutional amendments for things that can be handled by laws. So the answer for me is no.
My answer is no for a slightly different reason. If you try and get it and you don't get it, it gives strength to the effort to monkey with the numbers on the court. And amending the Constitution is necessarily hard. And getting 2/3 of the states, getting the necessary votes in Congress, and getting 2/3 of the states to ratify is difficult. And the failure to get that, I think, would add in a perverse way strength to the effort to monkey around with it.
There's one of the members of the audience has just mentioned that.
Are these all going to be anonymous questions? I thought we just heard a lecture about fairness and precedent and procedure. We have the right to be confronted by our accusers.
Well, one of these anonymous people is probably the one who wrote the op-ed for the New York Times. And whether the left, the Democrats, are targeting people who are now still just 17 years old, but will get to be voting by the time the election comes along. Are we doing the same? Are conservatives doing the same thing? Are we focusing on people as they age into the vote, into the electorate?
Not nearly enough.
Mr. Rove, I acknowledge.
There we go. Courageous individual stepping
Thank you very
forward.
much, man.
So I don't think nearly enough, and this is why my answer to the previous question was to try to rally the folks in this room who have the ability to do so, to support this kind of an effort. This is something that I've studied for the last well over a decade, and the idea, in fact, the folks I was sitting with at breakfast raised this quote that is sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill, which goes something to the effect of, if you're young and conservative, you have no heart. If you're old and liberal, you have no brain. Fun fact, Winston Churchill never said it. If you go to the Churchill Foundation website, they have a list of things he never said that people attribute to him, and that's one of them. But also the data doesn't necessarily show that it's true, that actually the things that happen to you in your political life when you're between the ages of 14 and 24 have a huge effect on your lifetime political views. And so while for some of the baby boomers, they went on this journey of being progressive, and then Reagan comes along and they become more conservative as they age, that's not necessarily the pattern for every generation. And for my generation, generation, millennials, we voted just as Democratic in this last midterm as we did in the midterm of 2006, which was the first one where you really had people from my generation participating. You know, I was a believer that Republicans needed to do better with young voters if they were going to be able to succeed. Donald Trump did about as well with young voters as Mitt Romney had, so he held serve, but still not very good numbers. And the problem that I think makes me the most concerned is not the 17-year-olds, it's the 37-year-olds. The 37-year-olds who now have had a decade and a half of voting for Democratic candidates, and Republicans have sort of failed to fully reach them. We always assumed, well, they'll buy houses, they'll have kids, they'll become Republican, and you just see this this bump in Democratic affiliation that keeps moving up as they get older. Now, there may be hope for those 17-year-olds. There may be a backlash. Liking Donald Trump or being Republican may be kind of punk rock these days. But what I'm seeing in the data says that 70% of those in Gen Z say they want a government that is bigger and does more things versus a government that's smaller and does less. So this is a group that really needs to hear the story of why markets and limited government are so important.
And Trump did lose the popular vote.
Right, right. An audience question is, what happens if the socialists win? Stock market, economic collapse. And this ties into a couple of questions that I had about whether socialism, not whether it can work, we know it doesn't work, but can it win, and can it change the country? Will it pass, or once it's in power and it changes things, is it here to stay? Karl.
Yeah, there's an interesting column by David Brooks about a month or 6 weeks ago in which he said, okay, let's have a thought experiment. Elizabeth Warren wins. What happens? He says the economy goes south because we have, the markets react negatively, that we lose the animal spirits among small business people. They start to pull back. We've already got a recovery that's lasted a long time. And so the economy turns south. Second, she's not able to get her program through. She's able to take administrative actions, anything she can do by executive order, but there are enough Democrats around who are not going to say, yeah, let's abolish private insurance in 2 years. Let's not uproot, Joe Manchin is not going to vote for something nutty to uproot the nature of American capitalism. And so she's unable to get her program through. And in the midterm elections, the Republicans, if they haven't already taken the House, take the House. They expand their numbers in the Senate. Her presidency is effectively over. She's another Jimmy Carter, only of a different variety, and there's a royal battle for the Republican nomination in 2024. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I wouldn't want to test it if at all possible.
Socialism today in America is inextricably mixed up with this, I suppose it's not so newfangled anymore, but anyway, sort of newfangled theory of intersectionalism, where the more that you can show, or the people who are belong to various categories which have supposedly been oppressed most in the past, so that if you're a woman, if you're a racial minority, if you're disabled, or if you're a sexual minority, whatever, your voice counts for more. If you're white, if you're a man, etc., it counts for less. It seems to me like a lot of gobbledygook and hocus pocus. It's really just a cover for a power grab. Isn't modern socialism in America really just a power game?
I think the rise of modern socialism and the rise of something like, so I have a slightly different take on why something like intersectionality has become so popular these days. Is that in part, it is people sort of saying, look, the discrimination that women have faced throughout history, or the discrimination that racial and ethnic minorities have faced throughout history, that these are all rooted in similar things. I think about it less as someone saying your voice is worth more or less because of the color of your skin, and more that inequities in society are sometimes linked to one another. And I think with young Americans in particular, nowadays having something like the social justice conversation be so present in their lives, that they're thinking about fairness, economic fairness, racial and gender fairness, these are all very tied together. And so if you feel frustrated that why does the CEO of my company get paid so much money when I'm working really hard, and is this economic inequality really fair? These conversations are being wrapped in together with conversations about things you hear Democrats talk a lot about, the pay gap, et cetera. So I think the conversation about the relationship between intersectionality and socialism is more just that people are looking at different types of things they perceive as unfair and viewing them as all linked, which gives the conversation more power, that if you feel one of those things is particularly unjust, it's a pathway to discuss the other ones. So as far as it being a power grab, I mean, I certainly think there are folks that feel like power has been too concentrated in certain segments of our society, and now is a moment where there's a lot of disruption and a lot of frustration. It's time to reshuffle who has that power, and that's why I think you're seeing so many people link that socialist discussion to these conversations around intersectionality.
Yeah, I think it's also a natural outcome of our emphasis on multiculturalism and hardline diversity. It's sort of like the issue of fairness and multiculturalism go together, and it results in the situation where you can say, I make demands as an affected minority. I feel this keenly. As a Norwegian American, I know that we suffered centuries of oppression by the hated Swedes. And so my voice ought to count more than the voice of that of a Swede.
You did react sharply when I mentioned Sweden, didn't you?
Yes, you did. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Even though but this is bizarre, the Swedes and the Norwegians have a natural rivalry. I've had a friend since college days who in the late 80s and the early 90s asked me to come over and help his political party, the Moderator party, the conservative party of Sweden, prepare for the general election, in which he was elected the first non-socialist prime minister of Sweden in 40 years, Karl Bildt. And I always thought it was ironic, and I'd kid him about it, that a Norwegian had to be brought in to help a Swede win an election. But you know, this is the amazingness, because intersectionality also goes along with it the theory that the only person who can stand in judgment of my demands is me. You are, by your very nature, if you're not part of my affected group, you have no moral authority to stand in judgment of my demand. You know, we were once a country that said, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And now we are going the opposite direction. Out of one, we're going into lots of manys, and by God, only the manys are in charge of determining what their fate is. And again, this feeds into the left, because then who has to be the arbiter of all of these demands for, which ultimately result in a demand for public resources? It's the government.
And also, who is the young, I guess you could say AOC, but I mean, in terms of somebody who's really an seriously electoral politician, who is the young leader? The interesting thing about this is that Bernie Sanders would be 79 years old on Inauguration Day 2021, and Elizabeth Warren would be 71 years old. Both would be the oldest presidents ever inaugurated. Bernie would turn 80 in his first year in office. And I mean, they are.
Are you ruling out that youngster Joe Biden as well? I mean,
he would be 78 years old on Inauguration Day. And we're in a very odd situation in which all the leaders, and this includes the president, who will be 74, are much older than anybody else. But in terms of socialism itself, or even progressivism itself, who is the young leader that's going to make this happen? We have socialists from an earlier era leading right now.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's one of the saving graces that the conservatives have, that not only are there is no sort of mid-range serious leader, but look, AOC came to Austin for South by Southwest. I went to hear for an hour and a half. First of all, the crowd went nuts at anything she said. I mean, it was like going to a rock concert. But also, I've never heard so many ums and uhs and likes in my life from a politician. And she'd be asked a simple question, it would sit there, let me say something exceedingly stupid. And people would applaud wildly. But, you know, I'm not certain that's durable. Right. And it is within the confines of a inner city New York district where she wins 18,000 votes. But Robert Francis O'Rourke is the closest thing we sort of come to that style. But those of you who are Texans here know what I'm about ready to say. We had no campaign against that guy. In July of 2018, he comes out for impeachment, and it's crickets on the other side. In June and July and August, he comes out in favor of Medicare for all, universal basic income, and a federal job guarantee, and it's crickets on the other side. Going back to my earlier point, if they're going to say these things, make them pay for them by saying This is not in accordance with our values. It won't work. It's bad policy. And I got a better idea. And in each of those instances, the Cruz campaign, for inexplicable reasons, was silent. I think because they didn't, unless you put it on a television ad, they didn't think anybody would hear it. But get it on an airplane, fly to 22 media markets, and make the point.
We're running out of time, so these are the last
Yes,
last
so I would
points.
just
Kristen
say you brought up Robert
Byron.
Francis O'Rourke, and I think the Beto phenomenon is a fascinating example in why it will be so hard for the current American socialist movement to find new young leaders, because they're so willing to cancel each other so quickly. So Beto, he rises up as he's going to slay the dragon, he's going to take down Voldemort in Texas, he's going to beat Ted Cruz, and then he goes and he loses, and then he announces his presidential campaign on the cover of Vanity Fair, "I'm just born to be in it." And all of a sudden, you're a white man and you're saying you're just born to be in it, to be the president? Hang on. And so Beto gets canceled. He no longer...
Robert Francis O'Rourke, please, don't use a funny
Robert
name.
Francis
You
O'Rourke
insist
gets
on the
canceled.
Robert Francis
And
thing.
that nowadays there's so
how he's
much
on the ballot.
these young leaders, they get built up by the internet culture and discussion around them, only for someone like an AOC, who she has managed to weather this somewhat well, but she had to let her chief of staff go because there was some shady, him making a lot of money off of a PAC that was affiliated with her campaign. Wait a minute, you're supposed to be the populist, let's get rid of the old campaign finance ways of doing things, and even she is impure on some of these fronts. So I think it's going to be a problem for them to find anyone who passes the purity test and can get away from the kind of cancel culture where anything you say and do, well, you can't be the leader anymore.
Well, nobody cares on the Democratic side because they live in a little bubble. They live inside the Democratic caucus, and she has the ability to engender some opposition to you on your home front, so they're scared to death of her. But in terms of being able to lead, I mean, she can frighten everybody into signing on to the Green New Deal resolution, but it ain't going anywhere. They got to have, I think you're right, they got to have a serious leader. They got to elect a governor or a major mayor who's seen as effective by people outside their world.
Mention of AOC would lead naturally into the discussion of the social justice warriors, but that's a discussion we're going to have tomorrow. We're going to leave this one here. Please give a great round of applause to the panelists for a fantastic conversation.